Probably the most exciting development Apple has going for them this year is the Apple Silicon Mac transition will be almost entirely complete by the end of the year. Most likely gonna get an event around October. There's some people suggesting September, but it just doesn't sound likely in my opinion. I hope I'm wrong, but I think it's safe to say within 3 months, we could be looking at lots of new Apple Silicon Macs coming out, and figuring out exactly what they're going to cost you is somewhat important. So that's what I'm speculating and gonna do my best predicting on today, and don't worry, the news is mostly good. Let's begin. So just to simplify pricing when it comes to Apple upgrades, there's always only 3 ways things can go. Prices for products can stay the same, they can get more expensive, or they can get cheaper. And the good news is, if we look at Apple's history with the transition to the M1 chip, the worst case scenario of Apple product getting more expensive actually hasn't happened at all. Between the iMac, the MacBook Air, and the MacBook Pro, the M1 chip going into all these different devices has resulted in the product staying pretty much the exact same price. In fact, if you start considering configurations and upgrades and the fact that the M1 chip is a one-size-fits-all for everything, so there's no, quad-core and hexa-core option, maxed out prices are probably a little bit cheaper with Apple Silicon, and with the Mac Mini, we got the rare case of the price actually being lowered by $100, which if you look at the overall cost of the Mac Mini, used to be $800, now it's $700 starting. Apple Silicon resulted in the product getting cheaper. Now, when it comes to the Apple Silicon we're excited for coming later this year, there's some new technologies being implemented that I'm not entirely sure will result in any prices going down very much. I'm particularly talking about the rest of the MacBook Pro lineup, which is I think the most heavily demanded Apple Silicon transition, just because there's so many of us out there that want even more performance than the M1 has to offer, which is already overkill and plenty, but it still limits us to only 2 Thunderbolt ports, and we want to see how much better the Silicon can get. And with these updated MacBook Pros, they're rumored to bring back MagSafe, the HDMI port, the SD card slot, but the biggest of the new technologies that should add to the overall cost is likely Mini LED. And in case you guys forgot, right now the only Mini LED Apple product is the iPad Pro, which originally the 12.9-inch version was $1,000. Once it adopted Mini LED, they increased the price by $100. So I'm not trying to cause mass panic here, okay? Don't freak out, but I think that a lot of the cost savings from switching away from Intel, which was inefficient, overheating, and expensive, and now moving into their own silicon, a lot of that savings might go directly back into the product, improving the display dynamic range and probably adding back some of these legacy ports. So my best bet with the MacBook Pro 14-inch and 16-inch variants is that the price should stay mostly the same, especially with the 14-inch MacBook Pro. The current 4-port MacBook Pro starts at $1,800, and I think that's a reasonable assumption to guess the M1X MacBook Pro, the smaller size, with Mini LED and the legacy ports and all that, will be $1,800, which in my opinion is still of tremendous value, considering this M1X chip is more than likely going to outperform even my iMac Pro. Now you're getting that in an all-in-one device with all these legacy ports, you're adopting Mini LED and all that in one product that's below $2,000. I think the value is going to be tremendous, and who knows, maybe they could get the price a little bit lower because there are rumors of them removing the touch bar. I kind of like the touch bar, so I'm kind of sad about that, but I get most people don't like it, so it's mostly fine. I get why Apple's removing it, but that was a big OLED display that was adding to the overall cost of MacBooks in the past. So I would say go into the next few months expecting it to start at $1,800, but if they do find a way to get it cheaper through eliminating the touch bar or switching away from Intel, obviously that would be fantastic. So I'm not trying to set unrealistic expectations and say, yeah, this new M1X MacBook Pro, this one's gonna be, $1,000 because it's so much cheaper. Yeah, $1,800 safe assumption as well. And the story might be a little bit different with the 16-inch MacBook Pro. The only reason I would say it might be different there is because those are used to having dedicated GPUs. And so far, the M1 chip has only made its way into devices that had integrated GPUs, and while the graphics performance of the M1 is not like insanely good, it's very good for the class of products that it's in, which is I think why a lot of people are excited for the M1X, is because this silicon is going to be going into Macs that used to have dedicated GPUs, so the integrated GPU on the M1X has to be very, very high performance and beating out all of those AMD Radeon graphics cards that Apple has been using for so long. And because Apple will no longer have to buy CPUs from Intel or GPUs from AMD, maybe there's a shot at making a whole system on chip a lot cheaper with the 16-inch MacBook Pro. Overall, I would still say to expect it to be at least a couple $100 over $2,000. Honestly, I would be very, very surprised if the 16-inch MacBook Pro started at $2K exactly. Currently, it starts at $2,400, which is again a good ballpark to start with, but the important thing to get excited for here is there's not going to be as many crazy configurations with the M1X chip. It's more likely going to be somewhat of a one-size-fits-all. I could see Apple giving a 32-core GPU to the 16-inch MacBook Pro and a 16-core GPU to the 14-inch MacBook Pro. That way you get a little bit more power if you're willing to shell out the extra money, but because of that, probably safe to assume around $2,400 for the 16-inch MacBook Pro as well, but who knows, maybe not having their own GPU will get that price lower. The other Mac we should probably expect the M1X to come in is the 27-inch iMac, which is still looking rather nice compared to the recently announced 24-inch iMac. But even with all those redesigns and all those white bezels and chins and shrinking the width on the outside, the 24-inch iMac still starts at the exact same price as the 4K 21.5-inch iMac it replaced. So it's only logical to assume that this updated iMac would also have around the same starting price as the current 5K one, but because the 24-inch iMac is sitting at a 4.5K resolution and there's been talk of that larger iMac potentially getting bigger, I wouldn't honestly be shocked if they decide to up the price a little bit more on this one, because they could see the 24-inch iMac covering a lot of the basics for average consumers. Not that a lot of people buy family computers anymore, but you know, the M1 chip's super powerful and the display is a lot bigger than it used to be and higher resolution than it used to be without increasing the price. So I would like to assume they could do it again with the larger size, but simply because Apple probably knows, okay, if the M1 isn't enough for you, you're probably willing to spend a little bit more. And that's why I'm anticipating a larger display with a higher resolution and the M1X chip. I'm gonna break from tradition a little bit here and say I think that the next generation larger size iMac will be $2,000 starting. Kind of matches it directly in line with the 16-inch MacBook Pro, and they might even throw in the 32-core GPU that's been rumored for the M1X, just because it's a desktop and it's going to be outputting at a much higher resolution than the M1X that comes in both the 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pros, just because the resolution overall is lower on those devices. It's just a hunch of mine. I would love to be wrong on this one, but because Apple's taking their time with the larger size iMac and they know that this one is not just replacing the 27-inch iMac, but also kind of replacing the iMac Pro demographic, I think their pricing is going to go a little bit higher, and the storage configurations and RAM options will be pretty good, but I think 1800 sounds just a tad too low for a display that's going to be pushing over a 5K resolution and rocking the most powerful Apple silicon in the world. So that leaves us with really only two potential Macs left. There's been a lot of talk of an M1X equipped Mac Mini, and because this one is rumored to have more Thunderbolt ports and to be more capable than the Mac Mini we already have with the M1 chip, I do think that the price will fall somewhat close to the Intel Mac Mini that Apple is still selling for some reason. So I'm anticipating $1,100 for that model, and there's even been some talk of it being redesigned a little bit, so whenever you start rearranging the components and having to redesign the chassis and that kind of thing, that always adds to the overall cost. So even though it won't be rocking an Intel chip anymore, I still think Apple's going to end up keeping the price the same on that one and not dropping it like they did with the M1 Mac Mini, because they realized that one only has 2 Thunderbolt ports, and now if those rumors end up being correct, then the M1X Mac Mini would actually have some hardware ports available on that option, not available on the base option. So I think that'll allow them to differentiate the two a little bit and say, okay, if you just need a Mac for the basics, this will be enough, but if you want a stationary, desktop Mac and the M1 chip just isn't cutting it, well, you're probably going to be willing to spend a little bit more, and Apple will be very proud, I'm sure, of the M1X chip's performance, so they're going to want to make sure that they secure a thick profit margin on that chip. But still, even at $1,100, this Mac would be the absolute best performing computer you could buy for that price point, and it would be the cheapest way to get your hands on an M1X chip out of everything we're talking about today. And I saved the best for last for this video because I was running polls. I was curious how most people were anticipating Apple would handle this, but we've heard from Bloomberg and various sources sources that the Apple Silicon Mac Pro is supposed to be quite a drastic redesign. Some people saying it would be about half the size of the current Mac Pro, and there's been talks of it having exclusive silicon, not the M1X. This one would be looking at, 32 high-performance cores, up to 128 GPU cores, so even substantially better than the M1X we've been talking about today. But because Apple doesn't have to buy these crazy, 16 to 28 core Intel processors, and they don't have to buy these really high-end AMD GPUs, and they probably won't even need the Apple Afterburner card, I actually think the Mac Pro has the biggest room for a price drop because the price is already so high. In fact, it's kind of insanely high. And I think a lot of that money is going towards the giant chassis being upgradable and the fact that you can slide the whole case off of it, and there's so many different modules that people can take apart and open up, and I think that all adds to the overall cost. But Intel, of course, being a huge cause of that, and because their CPUs run so hot, Apple had to design a giant thermal case like this that is pretty good at cooling the insides, whereas if we're making the transition to ARM, I do think thermals will be important and cooling it will be a factor, but it just won't need as much space. It won't need to be as big, so that means less parts, less complexity, probably less upgradability and modularity, so that's kind of a downgrade, but I do think overall the value will be much better. So I was actually really happy to see on these polls that people are pretty evenly split, There's a decent quarter amount of people that were anticipating the new Mac Pro to start somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000, which is really, really low. In fact, the old trash can Mac Pro started at $3,000, but there's also a quarter of people that were still expecting the Mac Pro to start somewhere between $6,000 and $7,000. So even with all these savings of switching away from Intel, there's still a lot of you out there that are assuming, no, price ain't going down because the silicon will be so good. Apple knows they can charge whatever they want for it, and no one will be able to say, hey, that's overpriced, because you can't get that chip anywhere else. So this personally is the Mac I'm super duper excited to see. We're probably not going to see this one by the end of the year. More than likely, it would get unveiled at Quadruple UDC next year. But I'm going to have to side with the polls on this one and say that I do think they're going to at least shave $1,000, maybe $2,000 off of the starting price of the current Mac Pro, just simply from ditching Intel, not having to pay insane amounts of money for those high-end chips, and having a physical machine that's way smaller and a lot less complex. So I do think it's not that crazy to assume the Apple Silicon Mac Pro will start somewhere between $4,000 and $5,000, but I could be suffering from too much wishful thinking. It's totally possible Apple could side with what a lot of people are assuming and just say, well, this M1T chip, or this super enhanced with 32 high performance cores and 128 cores for the GPU, yep, no one else on the market is offering anything like it, so you're gonna pay us, and we're gonna charge whatever we want, and you just gotta live with that. I don't want that to be the case, I would like Apple to realize, hey, we can make a lot better value Macs now, but knowing Apple, I could easily see them going either way, especially as Apple has always kind of wanted the latest Mac Pro to be built in the United States, which is good on one hand, but at the same time, it usually results in everything for the Mac Pro costing way more, $700 wheels and that type of thing. So if they end up manufacturing the next gen Mac Pro in China, they could probably lower the price a lot more for it, and there's a reason Apple doesn't manufacture the Mac Mini, the MacBook Air, the MacBook Pro in the United States, because if they did, it'd probably be a lot more money. So those are my predictions. I would love to hear your guys's. Do you think prices are across the board gonna not change at all? Could you see certain product categories getting more expensive and other ones getting cheaper? Feel free to let me know. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you guys in the next one.